So I'm Gary Sanfason. I'm with the newly formed department, although we call ourselves an office, the Office of Sustainability, Climate Action, and Resilience, OSCAR, which Michelle Krizek is responsible for that acronym. Thank you, Michelle. Susie Strife is the department head for that, and we're really excited to be kind of newly formed. We have a new first day on the job right here. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Christian Herman. I'm a climate communication specialist, and I just started 15 minutes ago.
Yeah, so it's really like Christian.
Make sure to meet him and walk him upstairs.
Yeah, Christian is going to be responsible for providing, really creating a coherent climate action communication plan for the whole county. So you'll be seeing him because he's going to be helping all the departments. So I started, as you probably many of you know, I was really involved in disaster recovery for the county for the last 10 years. But Susie Strife has been working on me for over a year to come over to the light side, as not the dark side, the light side, and join the adaptation planning world. And I've resisted and finally came over, and I'm really excited. She convinced me to come over to that world. And in order to come up to speed on what's going on in that side of the planning world, I went to a couple trainings last year. I went to the GARE, the Government Alliance for Racial Equity and Advancing Racial Equity, and the National Adaptation Forum to learn about what are the best practices in adaptation planning and resilience planning. And really what's kind of really going on right now is the nexus between mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction, adaptation, which throws in a lot of things like mitigation, more around mitigating the impacts of climate, resilience, and also equity. What's the nexus? How do you not silo those things, but how do you integrate those? So I went around to a lot of different seminars to learn about that, and Providence just came out heads and shoulders above all those other communities doing this work, and there's a number of reasons for that. One, they centered their work around equity, and a lot of folks say they do that, but what you see is they have a page maybe in their plan about equity, or they have a few strategies around equity, but you'll learn they centered their work around equity, and they'll tell you what that means. The other piece is a lot of communities talk about, well, we're doing community-driven work. They might do a lot of outreach. They do a lot of social media. They can say, oh, we had thousands of people participate in this process. That can be very surface. These folks created a Racial and Environmental Justice Committee separate from the city. It wasn't a city committee. And there's two members here who I'll introduce. And that committee drove the whole engagement, involvement process. And they'll talk more about that. The other piece was, this was really, when they'll talk about this, a deep democratic process. And this is a process that they're on a journey on. It's about sharing power with the community. And it's about building capacity with the community about how to do that, and learning as a government how to share power. And I think that's something that we're trying to do as a county, and learn about that. And then finally, when they were presenting, as you all attend conferences, it's usually 99.9% it's this person, right? The white person typically, right? The government staff person who presents what they're doing at these conferences. This is Leah Bamberger, who's the Director of Sustainability at Providence, who comes and presents. But at this conference, it was Paul Tavarez, who is the Operations Director with the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. It wasn't Jesus, but someone similar to Jesus, Holguin, at the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. So it was two community members and the director of the Sustainability Office. So that to me was a signal. They're walking their talk. They're sharing power. So that was a big highlight to me, that this is a community to follow and to watch. And then later in the year, they released their climate justice plan, and to read that was very different than a traditional climate justice or action plan that was expert generated. So without further ado, I want to introduce these folks and welcome them. Thanks for coming out. They've already done a community presentation Monday night. Yesterday did Longmont. Today they're going to do the commissioners, and then City of Boulder. So really thankful for them coming out. So they're going to do a brief presentation, then open it up to questions. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.
I know we don't have we have about an hour, but I would love to hear real quickly who's in the room. Just want to do like a quick round of introductions, your name, your role, and what you're curious about. Yeah, it's great to hear who's in the room, and we're gonna share an overview, probably 20 minutes or so, and then try to get into questions. And we'll start with a little bit of context about Providence and Rhode Island, but also acknowledging that we're a very different community, and this work, it must be absolutely rooted in place and in the communities here and the people here in Boulder County. So in Rhode Island, we are a small state. We are coastal, and I don't know if the T-shirt is factual, but we do claim to be 3% bigger at low tide. And the picture on the upper left is a hurricane barrier. The city of Providence was twice demolished by hurricanes. You wouldn't maybe think that, given we're in the Northeast, but because of the geography, it can have a substantial impact if it comes up the Providence River. And so that hurricane barrier was built in the 50s. So our issues around climate change are really centered around the coast. Certainly heat, too, is sort of the forgotten one, but very, very concerning and impactful going forward. And then, and of course, these impacts do not affect everyone equally. So we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and so just for some context around the history and the land, Rhode Island is primarily the land of Narragansett peoples. As you can see, there's a celebration of a powwow of the Narragansetts there. So when settlers and colonizers came to Rhode Island, they came to the summer homes of the Narragansett people, and they came in the winter. So the Narragansett peoples are nomadic, and they move seasonally. And in the summer they have a home, and in the winter they have a home. And they came to Providence, and they saw the settlers came, and they saw empty settlements, and they found food in the ground, right? Because that's how you stored food before a refrigerator. And so they were amazed. They said, wow, this land is so bountiful. There's just food in the ground waiting for us. It's a gift from God. Providence, right? They named it that. And so from there, you have to acknowledge the original displacement of the indigenous folks who were there. And shortly thereafter, we have the slave trade in Providence, which led to massive amounts of wealth, given the industries, and Providence being known as a port town. Shipbuilding was made there, and just north of Providence in Pawtucket was the start of the Industrial Revolution in America. And because of that, there was incredible amounts of wealth were gathered, right? As we know, the cotton was grown in the South and brought north to be processed, and the industries in the North were able to gain massive amounts of wealth, which eventually led to more industries in town, and more industries such as jewelry making, silversmithing, furniture making, boat making, all led to congestion and even more displacement as the Narragansett peoples, they had a rift at one point, and the northern Narragansetts came to settle pretty close to this, what would be on the outskirts of Providence, but pretty close. So they settled around here, and Providence Center is around here. And so as it grew out, they were further displaced. I actually live around here in what is called Mashapog Pond, and Mashapog Pond was the home of the ancestral home of the northern Narragansetts, and they were also pushed out of their homes as the city grew. And so we have to also remember that around this time, as the city's growing, there are freed black people living in Providence, and they were also displaced and moved around generationally. This past weekend, I came from a conference where we learned that in a period of around 13 years, around 60% of the homes, more than 60% of the homes in the South Side, which was a primarily black neighborhood in Providence, were demolished and made space for other things, which Jesus will mention later on. So that's, with these industries came a legacy of these buildings, and we have to remember these are factory buildings made with things that we know now to be incredibly toxic to humans. And currently, many of these buildings are being renovated and remodeled to be homes and to be businesses, and they're oftentimes along rivers. So the history of people kind of dumping their things into rivers and their toxins kind of continues to this day, as we have people in more congestion being placed next to our waterways. And so we just have to remember that the legacy of the Industrial Revolution is this massive spike in CO2 in our air and carbon, but it's also the displacement of peoples and treating people like they're disposable. And so when we do this work around climate justice, we have to remember that there's this legacy that we're contending with. There's this unaccountable capitalist system that was allowed to produce this massive spike, to produce displacement, to produce disposable peoples, right? And when we're actively looking at how can we change this, we have to keep that in mind and bring that to the forefront.
Thanks, Paul. With what Paul just said, with all the development and the industrialization of Rhode Island, where people decided to live, work, and play really determined what our frontline community looks like right now, right? So this map right here just shows you this areas where where's more predominantly minority folks, black, brown, Asian, African American, Latinx, and even indigenous folks within that all live within that area. This is just for a little bit of context, as we were discovering as part of our process was really discovering what is our frontline community, who are they, what do they look like. We really had to take the time to really build that out. So part of the process was just taking the time to figure this out and see who is that community. So this is Providence right here. This is a little hard. So this is Providence right here. Some of the things I like to point out with Providence, just because I think it's funny, we're kind of shaped like an old man. If you see in this little area right here, this is Providence. This area right here would be his hair. This is his forehead, his nose, his little lip, and a little chin, I forgot that's what that's called, and a little neck right here, right? But if you see all through on the temple and the neck, that's all the black and brown and indigenous communities that live there. This little area, this gray area right here is really where that's Blackstone Boulevard, is really where Brown University is, the more wealthier neighborhoods. That's really where the settlers decided to settle. Right, that was where they decided to call home. They said this is where home's gonna be, and of course you don't put your work and your home in the same place. So this was all home and settlement and where they were gonna play. And over here at the port was where they decided that was work. Right, that was the industries. That was where ships were being sailed out of. We have one of the best deep water ports in Providence, so there is a lot of traffic and a lot of space for boats to come in and out. So just talking about the map itself, these are our asthma rates, right? And these are the folks who have asthma, and it's crazy when you think about a community that's so small and there's a community that isn't even affected at all by it, right? Sorry, the button got stuck. Up here is just another more for context. This is our kindergarten age folks with elevated blood levels. Again, you see that. Oh yeah, for lead. They got blood. So over here, you'll see again the communities that are more greatly impacted are the Black and Brown in the south side of Providence. Again, this is where the port is. This is where, I guess I could show you this next map. This really shows you what folks are impacted with and who's there and who lives there. And so this is really important when we're talking about who our frontline community is and who are we really trying to target. It is the people who are surrounded by like I-95 and have to deal with the exhaust that comes out of there. It is the folks who have to deal with the Port of Providence and the industries that are there and the toxic chemicals that are stored there, the train tracks that lead into all that also circle around the our frontline communities. And so when you start to see this collective impact of climate, of just the way that the climate affects us, it's all like on our Black and brown and homeless folks and like our indigenous folks. And so really taking the time to see what that looks like in Boulder is really important.
So given that context, I started with the city of Providence 5 years ago and was just really starting to learn about what it means to be thinking about equity and sustainability. And we had an existing plan, Sustainable Providence, that was done in 2014. And looking at that compared to looking at what I was seeing and getting to know the city of Providence, there was a dramatic contrast. The Sustainable Providence plan was a very kind of typical sustainability plan, talking about clean, building energy efficiency and community gardens and water efficiency, those sorts of things, and looking at the issues that were facing the communities in Providence, things like lead in some of those lead rates, was like 30% of kindergarten age children have dangerous levels of lead in their blood. The asthma rates, we have the highest asthma rates in the state, and Rhode Island is one of the highest states in the country for asthma rates. So these are dramatic environmental health issues that are facing communities today in a very serious way. And they weren't being addressed by the Office of Sustainability. It wasn't really a focus. So that needed to shift. And we really wanted to start centering frontline communities in our work in order to bring these issues to light. And so in order to do that, we launched this Equity and Sustainability Initiative. We partnered with the Environmental Justice League of Rhode Island, and we really wanted to make sure that it was a community, that frontline communities were leading this conversation. So instead of saying, oh, we're going to add a equity section to our sustainability plan with some goals around equity, and we're going to talk to some people about what those should look like, we really wanted the frontline communities to inform us on what that work should look like and how we should be approaching it. And so this was back in 2015. And just a little bit of context on why we were approaching it this way. Who's familiar with targeted universalism? Or also universal design is kind of very similar. And I think you're all familiar with vegetable peelers, right? All right. So this company, OXO, was founded by a gentleman whose mother had arthritis and couldn't use this vegetable peeler on the far right. She really struggled to use it, and she couldn't grip it because the handle was so small. So he modified it. I think he put some like clay or Play-Doh around it so she could hold it, and ultimately designed this other vegetable peeler that she could use. And the idea of targeted that's an example of universal design, right? You design things so that everyone can use it. So another good example, rather than having stairs and then you add on a ramp, why not just have a great ramp that everyone can use and get to where they need to go? So targeted universalism is about designing for those who are most impacted or most marginalized in our communities. And the idea being that we often design policies and programs for the masses, right, in the middle here. We don't really, aren't concerned too much about the folks over here that, like the 1%ers who don't really need the programs, but we want to get like the masses involved. We set targets, we want to reach thousands of people, we want everyone to be using it. So we design for the middle. With the idea that it will eventually sort of trickle down and help everybody. But we know that doesn't really work that way, right? So the idea with, similar to universal design, the idea of targeting universalism is that we design for the folks over here. And it's like the opposite of getting the low-hanging fruit first, right? We want to spend all our effort getting the most difficult fruit first, and then we'll work our way down. And so another way to think about it is with this target over here, and this is, so you have sort of like different levels of marginalization in society, right? You might have gender being one of them, disability, income, and all of those kind of represent one of these lines. But it's important to note that with each of those lines, you have race as a factor, right? Race is always on the outside of each one of those. And so that's why we lead with race in this work always. And kind of the idea being you start here and work your way in when you're developing policies and programs so that you can make sure that you're serving everybody. So when we launched the Equity and Sustainability Initiative, we created the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. We didn't really know what it was going to look like, right? We didn't have, it was funded by a grant, and the funders were very supportive. They actually encouraged us to slow down and focus on relationship building and trust building, which was really important because the process, in fact, took 2 years. And it resulted in creating this racial, equitable, and just Providence framework. So it's a set of principles and values, starting with some acknowledgments of how people of color have been harmed by city government, and leading into these principles and values that are now guiding all of the work that we do. The Office of Sustainability adopted this framework. And we continue to work with the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee to make sure that we're adhering to this. So this is not a one and done. It's not like, all right, we have this kind of checklist, now we're equitable. There's a big accountability component here, and the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee is critical to that. So we still work with them very closely to make sure that we're adhering to this. And shortly after that was released, or in the process, our mayor committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. We received another grant to make a plan to meet that goal. And at that point, we had just released this or formally adopted it. We're like, we're gonna develop this climate action plan with this framework. And that is what ultimately resulted in the climate justice plan. So that was essentially another 2-year process to create this plan. And we didn't even really know, we weren't calling it a climate justice plan until the very end. We were just calling it this is a climate action plan with an equity lens. Like, we didn't really know what it was going to be. But it eventually emerged into this plan, and I think Paul's going to talk a little bit about the process.
Yeah, and so a little bit about the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. We are a committee of around 10 folks representing different seats, and each seat are one of those, Jesus talked about the in frontline communities, so we wanted to represent our frontline communities and make sure that each area was represented. So some seats are geographic, specific to neighborhoods. Some seats are specific to sectors such as youth and education or environmental justice. And so each of those committee members has a network or a base of folks that they're in contact with, in communication with. And that network is in flux, right? Recognizing that people show up to this work at various capacities. And so when we were making this plan, we asked that network, that base, very simple questions. Like, we didn't talk about metrics and different things that a policy analyst might look at in order to make a plan. We asked them simple questions such as, how do you stay warm in the winter? How do you stay cool in the summer? How are you getting around town? Is there anything in your neighborhood making you sick? And if you could change one thing about Providence, what would it be? And so from those very simple questions, we created that space for our frontline community folks to really get intimate about the details of their lives and the things that they struggle with, and so that was what allowed us to really produce a comprehensive plan that was centered in our community because it was rooted in their stories. And that's one thing that the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee really focuses on, and make sure that we have the stories of our frontline communities centered and at the very forefront of our work. So the plan, produced all sorts of things that you might not see in a traditional plan, such as collaborative governance. Oftentimes people ask me, why is housing included in your climate justice plan? And, I have to always tell people, well, people and houses are part of the environment. So that's what people are living in. So we need to address that. And so some of the things that we, these are some of the quotes and some from the stories that we pulled out from the plan. And one of them that I want to highlight is why are buses in Rhode Island so hard to use? Not enough routes and stops, not on time. You just need a car around here. And if you can't afford one, it's really difficult to get around. And so I just wanted to highlight that story really quickly and just thinking about when folks oftentimes plan cities, especially in Rhode Island, they plan them around cars. They're not really a focus on buses or bikes or people walking. And so only now we're really getting into Providence is really addressing that issue with the mobility justice group that's forming and really trying to push a new plan. But I like that this is also included in our climate because we have to consider how people are getting around and what are the means that they're doing. So Jesus mentioned a highway. There's a park in Providence that is literally surrounded by highways, and it's one of our bigger parks. It's one of it's Roger Williams Park. It's the place people kind of go to. There's a zoo. It's a central location, and I grew up there. And it wasn't until I went through this process of what was it called? It was the energy democracy training, where we mapped out our region's energy sourcing infrastructure. And it was only then that I realized, this park I grew up in is literally surrounded by like 95 on one side and a state highway on the other side. And so we're literally just being inundated with all these toxins that cars produce, right? And so I wanted to bring that and highlight that into a room of people who plan and make that, because it's often the things that we miss and the things that we're not necessarily considering that may have the biggest impact on our folks, on our communities. That's pretty much it.
So Paul mentioned the plan has a section on collaborative governance, and that was really important. And it's in the forefront of the plan. It's the second chapter, and the first one being lead by example, like what the city's going to commit to do in municipal buildings. But right thereafter, we talk about governance. And this is where we get into accountability, as I mentioned, is really important. How do you make sure that as we're implementing this work, we continue to use this model, this partnership model, collaborative model, to make decisions? Because if we just go and implement the plan without being in partnership with frontline communities, we will likely cause harm to these communities. That is what history has shown. That's been our pattern. So we need to be making decisions with community, not for community. And this collaborative governance model is designed to do that. And there's a lot. I know there's like a lot of words on these slides, but this is just to give you a sense of all this information is available on the Climate Justice Plan website. But starting with these essential conditions for collaborative governance, the commitment to that sort of model, making sure you're communicating clearly and have a transparent decision-making process, community organizing and power building, right? So at all of this work, it's not even, I wouldn't even call it a co-benefit, but a really important component of this process has been building that capacity and sharing power with community members. And that has been, it's a practice. It's not something we're ever done with, because there were some questions earlier, comments about like what does power building look like and mean. And it really means shifting decision-making power, and it means sharing resources. It means resourcing community members, so you're paying them just like you would be paying a consultant to participate and share their expertise in a process, right? We value engineering expertise, but with money, but we don't often value community expertise in the same way. We need to level the playing field there. Another big piece of it is city resourcing, so making sure that staff have system change and racial equity analysis, as well as lived experience and that experience collaborating with impacted communities. Trust and relationship building is a big part of it. There's a lot of great information here, and this is even just a summary, so I encourage you to dig in. And the other sort of big piece of this is the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. So the idea here is we need to shift how we work with community. From most government work is on the sort of inform or consult stage. So when we're informing community, we're just providing them information, fact sheets, etc. When we're consulting, we might be asking, what do you think? But we're not saying, we don't necessarily listen, right? So we don't, our plans don't necessarily change based on what people say. We hear them, but that doesn't necessarily translate into action. And then the next step, when they're really involved, their voice is at the table, they are heard, their needs and assets, community needs and assets, are integrated into the process. And so the message to community here is, you are making us think and therefore act differently about the issue. But again, they're not holding any decision-making power. And as you move along to collaborate or defer to, you're really shifting that power, right? And so one of the ways that we do that is with our resources. We have a third-party facilitator and project manager for the Racial Environmental Justice Committee, and they generally, they're also the fiscal sponsor for the Racial Environmental Justice Committee. So resources are, whether we get a grant or the REJC gets a grant, they're held in that with her, essentially. And so we all make decisions together about how we're going to spend those resources. And that's really important. It forces us to collaborate in a very, very different way, rather than oftentimes, government has the funding and we might, decide to share it when we want to, and in ways that we agree to, and it's not necessarily a collaborative decision-making process. So the idea is to get as far to 5 on the spectrum, and I think it's also just important to note that this work is, it builds on itself, and you can't just jump from a 1 to a 5, right? You have to do the work to build those relationships, build the capacity, make sure that communities are kind of scaffolded and resourced so that they can be equal partners in the work and they can be collaborators with you. If you're at an ignore stage or even an inform stage, community generally won't have the resources to really be that equal partner in the work. And I think it's also important to know, like, even on the ignore, sometimes communities are so marginalized that they have their own ways of working, and it's almost like a circle, right? Because they're become so self-sufficient and so adept at getting what they need without government. And that's, if you're at that stage, that's important to acknowledge as well.
So 2 things. Leah just talked about the experiences of community and really, like, giving them the space to give their knowledge of living in a community and their lived experience, and like justifying that knowledge and compensating that knowledge and respecting it. And Paul got to talk about a little bit earlier around the 5 questions that we asked folks, and a lot of that was really getting that life experience, right? What is that day-to-day experience living in Providence? What is your story here, and how do we bring this story into this work, right? And so through that, we've been able to, like, just think about, like, that's where our work has come from, and to really make this work real, outside of listening to people's stories, because that's when you actually hear the, like, real on the ground how people are impacted. We came up with something called Future Stories. Future Stories is really that same story from our frontline community, right? Making sure that we take that story of our frontline community that is current and see what do we want it to look like in the future, right? What does that story look like when we have succeeded in these things? How do we make this like a real image for folks, especially in Providence, to like see how their day-to-day will change? If you have the opportunity, I would definitely say check it out. There are some good stories in there. And then all of what we just talked about today is really just the history of like where our work has come from and like how we've gotten to the place to like create this change and do this work. Now some of the like real tangible stuff that we're going to be working on in the future is like the green justice zones, which is like two designated areas where we determine have high impact, and that is the Port of Providence and Oneyville. Again, the Port of Providence is where our utility provider is, the storage, like there's like chemicals that are stored there. Oneyville is just another neighborhood that again is circled around by like the state highways, the railroad, that bring these chemicals into the port of Providence. And so really working with that community there, really discovering what that frontline community is in those areas to start creating those changes that they want to see in those areas. And then we have other conversations around community choice aggregation and energy reporting for large buildings are just like all things that we're trying to like hit on with our next, the work that we're doing.
Yeah, thank you. So, I know we don't have a lot of time. We want to do questions. I've seen this 4 times. So they said a lot more other things. I'm happy to, if you have more questions after this, I'm happy to talk to you, go into more detail. And I have this presentation I can share with you. So, questions? Go. Jill.
So I think the way we try to do it, we're trying to move towards a space of independence and getting our grants directly towards the REJC, but sometimes the grants do go to the city, and it really depends on who's actually applying for it. The idea being that money for the REJC will go to the REJC and it won't necessarily go to the city. However, currently we have a grant that went to the city and was used by the city to hire a climate justice associate, which is a new person that's meant to support the REJC and the work of the climate justice plan. But the direction that we're heading towards is complete. REJC gets their own funding, gets their own grants, but I don't think we necessarily share in the sense of like, we say this is what's going to the city, this is what's going. Right? Yeah, we just kind of come up with the budget together. I don't know if we would add more.
Yeah, I guess I see it as like concentric circles, right?
Yeah.
But I think the idea is that generally it's all done to an extent in collaboration, right? So we're trying to make decisions together. The city does, at least initially, has taken the lead just based on capacity and resources to write a lot of the grant proposals and get the resources to get this work started. And I think there's definitely a transition where we want to see that shift to the Racial Environmental Justice Committee, who has the relationships with funders and has the ability to write the grants and receive the funds directly to support their sort of just like operational needs and making sure that the project team is supported and they have stipends to support community members, kind of those like basic needs. But yeah, I think like with this last grant that Paul mentioned where we were able to hire someone in our office, that was one that the city took the lead on writing.
Don't you have a fiscal sponsor though?
Yes.
So they have a fiscal sponsor. It's not the city receiving the money.
Well, in this case, it's been both, right? So in this case, the opportunity was for the city. So the city received the funds. And so some of it was used to support staff, and then some of it was used to support projects, and then we had to like basically go out to bid for that work, and we worked closely with REJC to make sure they were in a good position to receive those funds. And so, but our procurement processes are not designed for community members to respond to, and that's like all part of the shifts that we need to be working towards. But certainly having a fiscal sponsor, and whenever we can, having the funds go directly to the fiscal sponsor is much more ideal. Well, I think again, having the fiscal sponsor who can write checks to people.
Right there.
Yeah, it's really easy.
Right
and like
there.
you can.
No, I think that is like some of like the figuring out what are the needs, right? And so I have worked with the city before where it's all reimbursement based, and then it's like I gotta wait 3 months, and like I'm not paid enough to wait 3 months to like get my money back. So to have someone who can like sit there and say like, oh, don't worry, we have like your stipend, or we have your whatever piece that you like. We want your knowledge now, and we're gonna like invest in you now, right? And like that's that piece that like builds that trust, right? Because it's like, oh, you care about my knowledge, and it's not on your time, like, right? And I think outside of that, folks who don't work in the city, like I would have the impression like y'all have all the power to do whatever you want. If you wanted to pay me right now, you could, but you just decided not to, right? And it's not the reality, because there's like, you gotta talk to somebody in one office and I gotta send it to someone else, but I don't care about all that. I care about that I'm broke right now and I need my reimbursement or something, right? And so I think that like when you focus on that need and like where the need is, and like talk to your community, because your community will tell you like, no, I can't wait, right? And like holding that and saying, okay, you can't wait, and that is where you are, and we're gonna meet you where you are, I think is important.
And sometimes it's easier for the city to buy a bunch of gift cards, right? And use that as a way for small things, but
Right.
But yeah, finding those community partners that, I mean, for like volunteer programs, like volunteerism is great for those who can afford to do it.
Right.
And I'm not suggesting that we should end all volunteer programs, but I do think it's important to make sure that we're thinking about like what is labor and how do you compensate for labor, and who needs that compensation. And it's great when people have the ability to volunteer, but making sure that you're not excluding folks from being connected to their government because they can't volunteer.
Part of the RAJC as a committee is, like Paul said earlier, we have like 10 folks who are the base. Well, not the base. They are the committee itself, right? And so within those 10 folks, each individual is there from a certain either demographic, region, or like place of work, or like specialized thing. They themselves are tasked with having like 10 other people that they have as their own base that they talk to. And so as we had folks come into the room for those 10 folks, they were already folks who are at the front line. They were folks who were leading the work in like environmental work, as a community member leading the work in environmental justice because they live in that community, or where folks are coming from, they have been displaced and housing was part of it. I outside of that, my other job, I work with like Youth Pride, which is an organization that focuses on creating safe spaces for LGBTQ youth and gender nonconforming folks. And so like I had a piece of that, like where I can, that was my base, and I can bring some of that. And that's not my only base, right? That's only one of the hats that I wear in my community. And so like many of the folks in who are leaders in communities usually are stretched thin, like, you know, using that while not trying to add something onto that, using that, I don't know, like that spread to like get folks into the room, who are the folks that we want to talk about. And I think that's really in the conversation of like figuring out what our frontline community was, right? And how are we going to impact, where are they? Like, I know y'all have like a homeless population, and you know, I don't remember where I heard it, but y'all were talking about camping, or like putting up tents or something. Public camping, right? And like that's an opportunity for homeless folks to like set roots somewhere, right? And so just within that time that it was like figuring out whether it was going to be legal or not, like people came out, right? They went and they started camping, right? And like really using those opportunities of like, oh, this is where you're going to be at. Like, I don't know if that made sense.
It does, yeah. So, yeah, it's really kind of engaging and being able to use networks and leverage stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for me, it's been a learning curve to like, and I have to keep reminding myself, like, just because I don't see it, that doesn't mean that engagement isn't happening. Those networks aren't being leveraged, right? So it's like moving away from this, you know, we like to count everything and say like, oh, we engaged 1,000 people in this plan, and isn't that great? And I couldn't tell you honestly how many people participated in the climate justice plan, and that is often like when folks challenge the work, the traditional like white environmental groups will challenge it because they weren't a part of the process. It's be like, well, how many people were involved, right? Like that's a common question we get, and truthfully, I don't know, because so much of that engagement with the base was happening in someone's living room or at work or over a meal somewhere, right? And you can't. It's just acknowledging that this is the way people actually work. It's very organic, right? We don't have these like coming to a meeting to have a discussion. Like that is such a white way of organizing, right? And that's not the way communities work. That's very inorganic. So I think that's an important piece to acknowledge. And just with our process in general, we really flipped the whole engagement on its head. We never had a big public meeting where people came out to contribute and share their input for the plan. We were very intentional and made sure we got, starting with the REJC, right, that initial set of folks was leading the process, and we were working with them, and then they were doing the work out in the community and having those more in-depth conversations, doing the interviews and that sort of thing. And it did get a lot of pushback, right? It did get folks in power who are accustomed to being heard and being centered in a process felt marginalized. And I kept them informed. I told them how we were moving the plan forward and what we were doing and what the results were throughout the process. But I never gave them an opportunity to provide input or shape the plan. And that was a struggle for me. I kind of like pushed back. I was like, well, we need to have a meeting. I need to, like, they're gonna, push back on this. And they did, but it was a good reminder from our team and the Racial and Justice Committee, like, that would be very disingenuous. Like, this plan is really not about their needs and their priorities. So if I asked for their input, and I know, like, we're not really doing anything with that. So again, kind of thinking about how you're being intentional about engaging folks and trying to rebalance the powers there.
It depends on, so the REJC is a bit of a not tiered because we're trying to remove hierarchies, but there's a project team that does more work, and so they get compensated more for their time. Yeah. And so the project team really guides the work, and the committee has ultimate veto decision-making power in the group. But the project team meets weekly and the committee meets monthly, and so we kind of compensate based off of like meeting times and hours of work done. And so the idea being that the committee does 10 hours a month, so each committee member does about 10 hours a month, and each project team member does around 20.
And generally, we pay, at least for the project team, we pay $100 an hour.
Yeah. And so Jesus is on the project team along with myself, and there are two others.
Committee member.
You're also an operation.
Yeah.
You're
Full-time.
full-time staff, yeah.
Yeah. So I am a full-time staff, paid differently than by the project team.
You're not a city employee, but
Right.
paid by this fiscal sponsor through grants and other things.
Right.
So are you a nonprofit,
We don't have a formal designation, and that's kind of a controversy in the committee because we don't necessarily. The context in Providence is that there's so many nonprofits and so many groups kind of vying for limited grants, and so, there's tension there. There's a push to become a nonprofit and become more formalized so we can have a better, clearer relationship with the city. And then there's the opposite saying we don't want to have that because it's so easy to be co-opted once you become a traditional nonprofit. And so we're still in that
I
conversation.
heard Leah say it's also easy for the city to say, oh, you're a nonprofit? You're just one of the many nonprofits now that we don't have to really partner as deeply as we have been.
Right.
They still want to partner deeply in this, because it's still.
It's a like hybrid. I mean,
Yeah.
there's not a great structure for it to fit in. So, and that lack of structure can be really challenging. But it's also, we're trying to not conform to an existing structure that hasn't worked, right? So it is this unique space that is designed to be collaborative. It's not, there are, as Paul was saying, there's tons of nonprofits and there's tons of advocacy groups that are fighting the city and pushing the city. And this is, it's a little bit of that. I mean, it's challenging the city for sure, and it's pushing us, but it's in a way in partnership, and we're committed to working together to make these changes that we know are for the best, the betterment of our community, and to dig into that work.
So I think what made this partnership work was the fact that folks were able to just we came to the table with this is what we're bringing to the table, and so the city was bringing their resources and the Office of Sustainability as putting on the line of these are we're here to work with you. Like Leah said, we work with the Environmental Justice League. And at the time, the Environmental Justice League well, we're still a part of the Climate Justice Alliance, you know, doing work around just transitions, building those like local community relationships. And when this partnership came up, there was a bump heads of like we're trying, I serve as the executive director of the Environmental Justice League, right? And so like as we're trying to bring folks into the room to say, hey, we have the city in the room, and like we're trying to like talk, they were like, nah, right? I'm not being pacified. I'm not putting a Band-Aid on anything else. I'm not whacking a mole, right? Like these are things our communities have already been a part of. Like it never has been like, although the intentions are good, never has been, it's always perpetuated a problem, right? And so a lot of it was like those first 2 years of like having those folks in that room and being like, but like this is how we're gonna have the conversation, right? And like really talking about what are our principles, where are we coming from this work, how is it that we're gonna be successful? And I think the piece that really solidified that and like helped build that trust was the struggling together, right? Which is like one of our principles, is like struggling together. Just because there's so many times in that process that we felt like, oh my God, I told you so. Like the city did their thing again. And through like struggling through that process, like, you know, in those moments of like, oh, this is different, right? Or we're building something different and it doesn't plug in as easy as anything else. And so struggling through that piece of like, how do we plug in? How does this, like, how are we justified in our work? You know, getting through building something tangible, right? Like building the just transition plan, building our principles, building that piece of like where our work comes from. I don't know, made it easier for folks to feel like they can be in the room, have ownership over like what REJC is, right? Like that whole conversation about like whether we're a nonprofit or not, right? That's part of that same conversation of like, do we get co-opted by the city? Do we have like our ragtag group of folks who are like, nah, we're just gonna hold the city accountable with just like our community power. And so I feel like that's that line that we're playing right now, or like figuring out.
And yes, there is an application to join the committee.
Yeah, I think that was, again, thinking about the recruitment process and how we started. We started with Undoing Racism trainings hosted by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And these are 2.5-day, very intense, hard-hitting trainings about racism. And we had... So how that helped us get started is it, I think, sent a message to community members, and the mayor did participate in the first one, spent 2.5 days with community members going through this training, as did a number of other staff. And it showed that, you know, the city, this is not lip service. We're really talking about addressing systemic racism and understanding these systems of oppression and how they're impacting communities. And it also set an important sort of ground leveling moment where, you know, when we talk about these issues, we all have a shared analysis of them. And it helps us from falling into the trap of kind of transactional change or simply, you know, providing lip service to the issue. We're really committed to getting at these root causes of racism, and we try to host them on an ongoing basis, at least once a year, and get more and more people, and it has paid dividends throughout the process, right? So one, just all the trainings are, you really need a majority of the room to be people of color. So we have a lot of community members in the room. We also had a number of some of the traditional environmentalists go through these trainings. And when we do get challenged, it's been incredibly valuable to have those folks sort of validate the process. So it's not just me or my team or the REJC saying like, no, we need to be doing this. There's other folks that can kind of defend our process and help like kind of calm that pushback and that challenge.
I think just to add on to that, to watch, again, like when we started this, I was also one of those folks of like, I don't want to be pacified. I don't want to be like, have my time occupied with this when I can be doing something totally different in my community. And that was the piece of watching the city, especially the mayor. Like I said, I wear many hats in my community, so like I'm pretty critical of my mayor and like on whatever issues it is, whether it's like talking about gender, sexuality, young folks' education, police malpractice, environmental, like I'm in his face. And so I pay attention to every meeting that he's at, whether he's there to just show face or whether he's there to like say, hi, the mayor's here, and then like run out the back because they got other things to do. And that's just how it is. But I pay attention to that. And to see the mayor stick through the 2.5 days and be there like fully committed, I was like, okay. Like now I feel like my city is actually here for me or at least thinking about me or thinking about how to help me. And which made me want to stick around and inform this process, right?
Yeah, and I think one thing about the training too that I just want to highlight is, you know, it's 2.5 days. We don't even talk about race until the second day, or not even like the end of the second day is when we really start talking about it. And for me, it's more of those concentric circles, and especially in this process of trying to bring around climate justice, you can't necessarily talk about the environment and the traditional things you think about in the environment until you talk about the people who are involved and the relationship that you have. And so something that really threaded throughout this is the idea of being in right relationship to each other as much as the land, air, and water.
So I want to thank you for being here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all for taking time.
Thank you.